Good evening, everybody, and it's my great honor to be here. I can't actually believe that I'm actually sitting here with the backdrop of this very important historic building. I have been introduced about, talking about this particular fort that I'm going to do today. I'm a bit overwhelmed. And, the fact that I came across this fort in 95, 96 as part of mapping heritage along the Grand Trunk Road. And I actually was quite shocked that there is a fort in Amritsar and people were not aware of it, and nor was I. It was just by chance that I came across this particular fort. It was only in 2004, between 4 and 6, that the fort was actually handed over by the army to the civilian government. And I'm very pleased to say that this is probably the only fort that has gone from the military to the civilian government. I worked on the Red Fort in the past, but even in the Red Fort, the change of land ownership did not happen. This is one fort where the transfer of the titles of the fort to the government of Punjab happened. So it's recovering heritage in terms of restoring it to the people has a very different meaning here in the case of Gobindgarh Fort. We call it a city, the talk is called a City in Remembrance because it's the grand finale of my work in Amritsar was in publishing a book which is called Amritsar, a City in Remembrance, because I've had the opportunity to work at monument level, then at an urban conservation level with the restoration of, Rambagh Gate, the gates of the city of Amritsar, the building built by the old DC office built by, designed by Bhai Ram Singh and several other sites. A glimpse into the story of Amritsar, and if I may have the presentation, please. The story of Gobindgarh Fort, and I'm mindful that this is going to be for 15 minutes. Next, please. Yeah. This is one man who has not enough justice has been done to his legacy, the contribution of this great Maharaja, Maharaja Ranjit Singh. At one point, I was asked by the current chairman of INTAC that Gurmeet, he's General Gupta, he asked me, he said, do you know what is the contribution, the biggest contribution of Maharaja Ranjit Singh according to this general? I said, no. This is about 20 years ago when he asked me this question. He said, the western borders of India were marked by him. If he had not consolidated Punjab the way he did, he said the western boundary of India would have been Delhi. So I would say that the legacy of Maharaja Ranjit Singh needs to be understood in multiple layers. Whether it is a military history or whether it is his contribution to a secular nature of the state and all the dynamics of his governance. So he needs to be understood in much deeper manner. Next. So Gobindgarh Fort, what was this fort? Now the man was born in 1780 and he took over Amritsar. It's a wrong word to use, but in the absence of a very developed vocabulary, I would say Amritsar became part of his area of governance and control in 1802. And Gobindgarh Fort was the Bhangiya, it was called the killer of the Bhangis because the Bhangi missile, had a fort, which was a mud fort. And it's interesting to see the location of the fort. So to the left where you see the dotted line, unfortunately, I don't think the mouse is going to work here, is where the fort is located. And if you were to see that the walled city of Amritsar, this map is a map of 1870. And what you see in the center of the walled city, where the pink mass is Harmandir Sahib. So this is probably the only city in northern part of India which has a sacred site towards the center, and the entire city is like a line of protection around the sacred site. And the Gobindgarh Fort is far out of the walled city on the western side in an alignment with the Lohgarh Fort, which was built by Guru Har Gobind Sahib. So it's quite interesting to see that particular alignment. And this bean-shaped city has had the ramparts, had 12 gates, had a moat. And where you have the circular road today is where the moat was, and a very, very thick rampart was there. The only segment of the rampart of Maharaja Ranjit Singh's period that you get to see is that the rampart which has the municipal printing press and a government school attached to the Rambagh gate. So I think it's very important to recognize what is the material culture of the city when you read history, and why it is important to be able to see these monuments in your landscape and not just read, but also connect it with material culture. Next. So you see the walled city, and you see the different katras, and of course an iconic painting of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, because Amritsar was his summer capital, and we are talking about 1802 all the way to the end of his life in 1839. Next. And the relationship, now to my mind, if you were to look far west, right at the back behind Akal Takht towards the skyline, I would imagine that the city was not tall enough to obstruct the view from the citadel of Gobindgarh Fort, and this is a very important photograph. The next image. Now, how did the fort come about? So this is the oldest reference we have of the Gobindgarh Fort in 1850s. And you see it in a very different form, but you do see the central courtyard, and you see these multiple fortifications around the fort, which make the fort. And you can literally experience that. Now, this fort was a mud fort, and Punjab has no stones. So you have brick buildings set in mud mortar, and then subsequently you also have lime that is applied, to protect the walls. The characteristic of mud forts is that it can withstand the impact of cannon fire as compared to very, very brittle material which could shatter. So easier to build, easy to repair, and very, very effective in warfare. Next. So while we were doing the conservation of the fort, we actually came across in that far corner remnants of the wall paintings from the earliest layer, which is the Sikh period layer. And you would see that these are the colors of the wall paintings that you would even find in parts of the houses in the walled city of Amritsar, or even in the summer palace on the upper floor, that use of this red oxide kind of on wet plaster. Next. Now, it's only after Maharaja Ranjit Singh took over the fort that he added another layer, because, see, this particular fort was a military stronghold. It was an administrative center. It had several buildings. There are accounts in the British Library which tell you about the residential aspect of the fort. Now, this is about 30 acres, the fort, and if you were to include the outer petals of the fort, which are called the ravelins, which is a French military engineer, Bourbon, who actually created a whole lot of forts which separate Europe from Russia. Maharaja Ranjit Singh had French generals in his army, and this introduction of those leaf-like formations on the periphery are called ravelins, and this is something which got introduced because the technique of warfare changed, and they had to protect the fort against cannon fire. So that is what the ravelins do. And interestingly, when the fort was being given by Government of India to Government of Punjab, they were first going to give just this particular square building. And I just happened to come here and look around. And I was walking with one of these young army officers, and I was looking at the ravelins, and I said, because they said we can only hand over the fort when the outer boundary wall is done, because you've got to cut it off from the rest of the military area. And he was telling me where that boundary wall has to come, and I was quite horrified to see that those petals would have been kept out. The ravelins would have stayed out, and we would have had a square fort, back to the footprint of the Bhangi fort. But then I took it back to the then Chief Minister, Captain Amarinder Singh, and we said, we're getting only part of the fort. And then he met with the ministers concerned in Government of India and said, either give me the whole fort or I don't want it. And the soldier in him was kind of very, very emphatic about this matter. So then there was this whole news. I remember the front page of Asian Age, which said an additional 15 acres are going to be given to Government of Punjab, so that the entire fort is given to the, and not a part of it. So the Ravlins and next. Yeah. So now you see this in particular map of Amritsar, the location of the Gobindgarh Fort, and you see part of the Summer Palace up north, which is completely fractured, and that's where it got its name as Company Bagh, because Rambagh, the Summer Palace of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, which was incidentally done in 1820. So between 1809 to 1820, Maharaja Ranjit Singh lived, when he would come to Amritsar, he lived in the fort. So where you are actually sitting, you're very privileged to be sitting here, because I do believe that the energies stay, you know, because what Punjab meant to him and what he contributed, I'm sure there are spirits here listening to us. When you see the Gobindgarh Fort and you see this large open space around it, what the line across here is the road leading to Lahore. And that's where his winter capital was, and Amritsar was his summer capital. And you can imagine people coming from Lahore to Amritsar, and you see these roads leading on either side of the fort. I hope you can identify where the fort is. There's this imposing building standing there. So it wasn't quite hidden the way it is today, you know, with the military area all around. You're supposed to be able to see the fort. I mean, even today, most countries who are sensitive to their heritage more than we are would make it very, very much part of their planning strategies to be able to see an iconic monument the way it is meant to be seen, and not kind of hidden the way, given the significance of the monument. Next. All these particular drawings, especially the paintings on top and the bottom, are all, they're not in India, they're in UK. And you get to see the skyline of the city of Amritsar, the moat. Below you can see the skyline of the Gobindgarh Fort, the way it was seen. And you see all that water all around. And there were marshy areas, and even today, if you were to look at the Google image of this entire military area, you would see on one side of the military area, it's very, it's not exactly marshy, but it's open and shrubbery, and there were these tobas and, you know, all that water that used to collect. So that naturally provided for protection, in the sense it would be a line of defense, you know, it would be that much more difficult to get to the fort. It's also important to see right in that painting below that towards the center, this particular building right behind me was a very important building, and it would have been a 3-storied building, and which was, the top floors were removed when the fort was occupied by the East India Company and later under the Crown. And that part of the building, right up front on the gates, was this towering building, and when you look at the silhouette, you can make out that there has to be some tall buildings in the center of the fort, which probably were the gate, or the palace of the Maharaja himself, where it can be called a palace. Next. Yeah, so this is how you would see the fort in the open areas. And next. So when you see it today, unfortunately, that tall building that you see is actually a water tank. But you do get an impression, this is during conservation when we could see the, you know, ramparts very clearly from the Ravlins. Next. Yeah. This is a very important image because it actually tells you, when you see that red line in the image on top, you actually see that this is the part above the gate. There were 2 floors. And there are written records which actually explain that that was the palatial residence of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. When I say palatial, I don't mean very extravagant, but clearly what you would call a haveli in Rajasthan is a palace in Punjab, because the man is known to not be too extravagant in his way of life and buildings. He had a great eye for the arts, but he's not known for grand buildings because of the nature of the person himself. The top of that particular palace was truncated when the British took over the fort. The top of this building as well was truncated at that point. The materials that came out of these buildings were probably reused to build the structure on top. So the top part of the structure is a colonial period intervention, which had the offices of the residence of some of the officers. The plinth is a Sikh period plinth. Similarly, that particular building, which was called the Dyer's Bungalow when we actually started working on this building, and has nothing to do with General Dyer, it was a hospital. And at one point it was called the Darbar Hall. It's not a Darbar Hall. So there are all this fiction around the monuments. This is actually a hospital, and this was the residence of the officers living here. So the nature of the lower painting actually show you what the top looked like with those chhatris and things like that, which is a typical way of, kind of completing a palace building on the upper level. Next. So the oldest part of the fort from the Sikh period is its moat, the moats and the remnants in the ravelins and the bastions, the lower part of the bastions and the fortification walls, which are now protected by the State Department of Archaeology. What you see on top, whether it's this building or that building or the upper part of the bastions, that is the Anglo part of the history. So I call this as an Anglo-Sikh monument today, because it's got both the layers of history. Because the narrative, Punjab being the last state that fell to the British, to the East India Company, and that entire dynamics when the Treaty of Amritsar was signed in 1808, the reforms that Maharaja Ranjit Singh did, and there were announcements made from this Gobindgarh Fort. The Tosha Khana, which actually had the Kohinoor. It also had a state prison. In fact, Shah Durrani was threatened that if he doesn't hand over the Kohinoor to the Maharaja, he would be imprisoned in the Gobindgarh Fort. A lot of farmans came out of the Gobindgarh Fort. So there are immense records in the British Library that tell you about how significant this fort was in the entire narrative of those 38 or 39 years, 37 years of Maharaja Ranjit Singh's rule, and subsequently all the way to through the British period and all the way to 1947, when suddenly it gets, the narrative of the Gobindgarh Fort gets disconnected from the people of Amritsar. Next. So I've already spoken about this building. Next. So these are the key years in the recovery and conservation of the fort. 1996 is the siting. 2006 is handing over, is Government of India deciding to hand over the fort to the civilian government. It took a couple of years to make the 3-meter high wall separating the fort from the rest of the military area, and the conservation of the fort that happened between 2009 to 2019. Next. Several layers of archaeological significance were found, because like I said, that several layers of the building were destroyed when the British took over. And this is something they did to the Red Fort as well. They've done it here. They did it to the Rambagh Garden as well. It's not that the British are bad. It's about that when you have a political, when you have somebody takes over a particular region or a land, they put their imprint on it. And that's a narrative, the historical narrative of a place. And that's something which happens everywhere. And they put their own layer. They also, by removing material culture, you actually disconnect a community from their legacy. Amritsar, for the longest that I have come here, they refer to the Rambagh Garden as the Company Bagh without realizing that the name comes from the East India Company. They've forgotten that Rambagh is Maharaja Ranjit Singh's summer palace, so it should be called Rambagh and not Company Bagh. And the way the Charbagh was destroyed and made into, the company garden, I mean, as much as we enjoy that open space, I think we owe it to the legacy of Maharaja Ranjit Singh to restore that building, that space back to, and still continue to use it the way we would like to use it by way of a leisure park and so on. But I think that footprint of that space is critical to be recovered. We've done our bit of effort with little bits and pieces chipping at the board, but it needs much more concerted effort. And it cannot be done without the involvement of the civil society. Professionals can only do that much and no more. Next. This is how this particular building looked. When I came here the first time, it had a club, not a club. In the army, they call it something where they come for the evening drinks and all of that. So that's what this place was. And then, of course, we removed the plasters, got the original form of the building out. Like I said, it's an Anglo-Sikh narrative. So we need to restore both the layers, but then make that information accessible to the people to whom the monument actually belongs. The reason why Maharaja Ranjit Singh changed the name from Bhangi Kila to Gobindgarh, because he was connecting the fort with the legacy of the community, with a just militaristic power. And I think that is something which needs to be upheld. That's the spirit of the place. Next. These are the kind of studies we did when we looked at the monument. The red part is the Sikh period, and the yellow part is the Anglo period. And that building is right behind the green room right here. And it took a while to understand it because we had to meticulously, I mean, it's a government-supported project, so I would still give it 6 out of 10, what we achieved in the monument. There was much more that could have been achieved, but when you're working with so many people, you're working in a public space, in a public domain, with public money, there can be a lot of heartburn, but the point is, one view is not something which everybody endorses. But we achieved what we could achieve. Next. The Tosha Khana, which was a Tosha Khana during the Sikh period, but became during the British period, it actually was converted into storing gunpowder. So it became a garrison at that point. And I had a very interesting collaboration with Tom Adiman, who's an archaeologist, a building archaeologist from England, and he's worked on these kind of typologies in the past. It was very interesting to be able to understand the 2 layers of history in this particular building, which is right at the back. It had a mint also, I think, at some point. Actually, the fort itself had a mint. It had workshops to repair the guns of the Sikh army. There would have been many more things that were happening here, which that information can be shared if one had more than 15 minutes. Yeah, so next 1 or 2, and I need to close the presentation. Yeah, please just show some slides and the open space that's been recovered. This is how we found remnants of some of the wall paintings of the earlier period. Next. Yeah, and places of archaeological significance that we found in the ravelins, which of course was the hardest task to protect, because that was something which just was not being appreciated by the Department of Tourism, because they just didn't understand why are those remnants of brick and lime important to be retained. But I think a lot was restored, maybe some was lost, but yeah. Next. And I think we can close here. Thank you.